All right, hello, and welcome to Real Talk Office Hours, Hunting for Silver Linings for this August 3rd, 2020. Hosted today by myself, Corey Hart. We have George Katsanos. We're both in West Michigan here, the Great Lakes region of the U.S., and we have a very special guest. We have Curtis from Singapore. He's a Startup Grind chapter director there. We're also joined by his co-director, so we're excited to involve him in the conversation as well. We're brought to you overall by Startup Grind, the world's largest startup community. We operate with 600 plus chapters in over 125 countries, and we have a mission to educate, inspire, and connect. We're driven by three values. That's make friends, not contacts, help others before you help yourself, and give before you take. And we do this program because the pandemic has been and will continue to be the great global leveler. And as entrepreneurs, we do our very best for our businesses, our teams, and our families, and we need to be informed, rational, analytical, and rigorous in our thinking. We should also learn to control our biases as they emerge in various circumstances. Now, we do invite everyone to join us live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday as we track the intersection of facts, biases, and action through our review of global financial markets, alongside check-ins and real talk with the Startup Grind chapter directors, entrepreneurs, and ecosystem stakeholders from around the world. And no one has a crystal ball, but if we keep our eyes and ears open and pay attention, we may be able to see around the bend and with some luck, spot the silver linings that are around every cloud. If you missed live events, you can catch them at startupgrind.com/grand-rapids. And before I introduce George for the global market update, a little bit of housekeeping. Comments made and views expressed by all participants in this podcast are not intended to invite or incite individuals, entrepreneurs, or investors to buy or sell financial assets, real assets, commodities, futures, and or options. The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform, not to trade or to invest. If you feel compelled to trade and or invest, please call your broker. Remember, however, risk is everywhere, and even when you think that you're not taking a risk. So with that, George, I'd love to hear some global market update from you.
Thank you, Corey. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Real Talk. TikTok. The emperor has decided that he does not like TikTok. So after a number of important individuals spoke to the White House, the CEO of Microsoft called the president, and apparently the latest news is that Microsoft is preparing to buy the operations of TikTok in the US, Australia, New Zealand. We will see. Clearly, the conflict is continued. Clearly, the political debate will continue for some time between the US and China. And in the meantime, the dollar has strengthened a little bit, as you see, against most of the currencies. After hitting 119 on Friday, it was inevitable that we would see a little bit of retrenchment across the major crosses. The sterling is down to 130, the yen is 106.4. 117 against the euro. Clearly, there is some concern about the decrease in the value of the dollar. And on the other hand, the bond market is actually telling us that nothing has changed. The markets remained relatively calm on the bond front. Throughout Southeast Asia, the fixed income market is well supported. India at 5.8, South Korea at 1.3, Singapore at 0.8, and so on and so forth, with Japan leading the stability with 0% yield for the 10-year bond.
In Europe, able to share your screen?
Excuse me,
I'm sorry, thank you.
Actually forgot to do that. Here we are. The bonds in Asia, as I mentioned to you before, in the lower end here, you can see that not much has changed in Southeast Asia, and the same picture throughout Europe. Again, 2 basis points is 0.02%. So nothing really has changed. Germany is, with Switzerland, are leading the way in the negative interest rate world with minus 0.5 and minus 0.57% respectively. And on the other hand, at the end of the spectrum, you have the high yielders like Greece at 1.07, Italy 1.03%, Portugal and the Netherlands in the middle with minus 0.3 respectively. Here in the US, the 10-year market, when the markets opened this morning, the 10-year bond yield was 0.548. It's now at 0.57, up 4 basis points. No change in Brazil, marginal change in Mexico, and Canada strongly unchanged. So we don't see any major flows out of the fixed income market. However, we need to be cautious. We need to see how the bonds trade, especially in anticipation of the next stimulus package that is being negotiated as we speak. And by the way, it was interesting to note over the weekend Muriel Rubini's comments about the callousness with which Congress appears to be negotiating this package. Instead of having been proactive to debate the pros and cons and the various approaches well before the expiry of the previous stabilization package, they're now 3 days in the package. So I think we should, again, at least pay attention to what is happening on the fixed income side. On the commodities front, again, the markets have had huge rallies over the last 4 months. The second quarter saw the precipitous decline in end of March, and then a tremendous rally across asset classes. The West Texas Intermediate is at about $40.3, no major change compared to Friday's close. The Brent is 43.6, again, no major change. The natural gas front, however, is rallying big time, close to $2 per 1,000 BTUs. This is really a phenomenal increase, and it could be due to the weather conditions. It could be due to the fact that there is increased demand as we're getting into the second half of the year, but we will see. I won't be surprised if soon we have a retrenchment in the price of natural gas. Gold, on the other hand, has had better days. It's at the moment at 1977. The high of 2005 that we saw on Friday morning has not been breached. However, the gold bugs are still at it, and with the dollar a tad stronger than Friday's, it's inevitable that we would have seen a reduction in the price of gold. Copper, on the other hand, is still well bid, 290 and change. That means the manufacturing picture worldwide remains unchanged, i.e. manufacturing has been recovering and will continue to do so. The grains, well, the grains are a strange story. They are a political story. Here in the US, we have had a wonderful summer so far. We've had ideal growth conditions. Corn, soybeans, and wheat have done exceptionally well. The crop is supposed to be one of the better ones that we've seen for some time. And the only thing that keeps these prices from falling further is a little bit of overseas buying here and there. It would be ideal for the farmers if China would change its mind and start buying again. But again, we can't see that happen very soon. On the equity front, what can I say? A green picture, with the exception of New Zealand marginally down and Taiwan 1.2% down. The Indian market fell by 1.8%, the Bombay Stock Exchange Index. The rest of Asia, green. The rest of Europe, very green, with DAX leading at 2.7%. The French are up 2.1%. The FTSE up 2%. So again, stimulus. The more stimulus, the better the equity markets are doing. And as I've always said, this is not a good signal. When we have high correlation across asset classes, then investors should be concerned. Our entrepreneurs and investors in the ecosystem of startups, in the startup grind community, should be concerned, should be careful about the investments they make, and they should be very sensitive to the fact that in a stop-go global economic environment, the attrition is going to be significant. We've seen that in any part of the world where the opening up has been aggressive, the virus has returned aggressive. And I think the recovery that we experienced in the third quarter of this year is going to be very positive compared to the dramatic decline that we saw in the second quarter. However, this does not and cannot cover the fact that the economies worldwide are suffering. Back to you, Corey.
Thank you, George. Appreciate the update. And we do this update Monday, Wednesday, and Friday before we get to our special guests. Because we find that paying attention to the global markets across all the different classes helps distill all the different news and all of the different noise, and helps inform us and paint a nice broad picture of what's going on as far as sentiment across the globe. And then we also like to hear about how different ecosystems are interpreting such things as we talk to our fellow directors. So with that, I'd like to introduce everyone to Curtis. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate you giving us the benefit of your time.
Great to be here, Corey. Thank you.
And first, before we talk about Singapore and the ecosystem that you have there, and then also, the great influence in the region, and I'm fascinated to learn more about it because other than being almost a top 10 ecosystem on the planet, I'm sure you can give us a lot of extra color, but I want to hear more about your personal background. Where did you get the entrepreneurial bug? It's its own kind of virus that infects, right, and never goes away. Your background and maybe what you're involved in now besides Startup Grind too.
Right. So, my story with Singapore pretty much began at the beginning of 2000. My family, actually, we moved there. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. So, I'm very familiar with the part of the region of the U.S. that you're in, Corey. And I finished up my high school there, came to Boston, to Northeastern University, did an internship at CNBC Television in Asia back in 2003. And then pretty much after I graduated in 2006, went right back out to Asia, just a few months in China before going back to Singapore. And when I went back, I started in a what could be called a startup business back in 2007. And, had pretty much worked in media and advertising in smaller startups and companies and firms. Before, kind of jumping over to most recently a few years ago to, people and talent solutions where we worked with a lot of startups to help them grow and scale with, remote talent that was based in the Philippines. And then I got involved in Startup Grind back in about 2017. And that's really where everything kind of came together for me. So, the background in media and advertising and doing sales, working, you have to be very entrepreneurial kind of when you do that, really kind of was where I got the bug, I guess you could say. And then it just kind of went from there, working in, talking to startups and interviewing founders, from Singapore and internationally when, they came through Singapore for Startup Grind. And then just the work that I was doing, through my jobs with startups. And now I'm helping a startup actually raise funding, a life sciences startup. So, it's just kind of, when I talk about it, it just kind of all flows together. And, that's really how I got to where I am today.
Great. And it sounds like with that varied experience and background that you're, perfect for the job of, being this great connector. And that's something that I've really enjoyed about being a director. And I'm a little baby director. I've only been doing this since the beginning of the year. So now getting into the ecosystem there, you did mention right now, you said life sciences. I'm familiar with that being like a hot sector in your area, as well as like fintech. A lot of coin offerings coming out of your region. Can you tell us a little bit more about maybe some of the emerging sectors that we're not necessarily so familiar with?
Right. Well, I guess the way, and you had the map up there earlier, you can see where Singapore is compared to the rest of the region. Singapore is really the hub of Southeast Asia's startup scene. A lot of the VC firms that fund startups in the region are there. A lot of startups are incubated in Singapore before spreading their wings and going to more markets in and around the region. What we've seen is, even with COVID-19, we haven't really seen a slowdown in deal flow. There's still been a lot going on. We're up about probably 60% on Q2 in terms of the number of deals that have been made. It was just reported. If anybody's interested in tracking the startup landscape, check out Deal Street Asia. They provide some really good information on that. But in Q2 alone, we saw about a 60% increase in the number of deals that were done. And really, e-commerce, fintech, and logistics are kind of leading the way in the region. It's actually, a pretty interesting story when you look at it. You're seeing a lot of these e-commerce players that were growing considerably before the pandemic hit really kind of kick into high gear. And the other thing that I think is pretty interesting is we're seeing the number of funds, the VC firms. When I came back to Singapore in 2007, there was maybe some angel investors and some people that were doing things with startups, but there wasn't a lot of VC funds in the traditional sense that you might see out of Silicon Valley. And we actually, over that kind of, last 10 years or so, we've seen a real influx of VC firms that are based in Singapore, investing in startups in Singapore and the region that have raised, second, third, and fourth funds that, are hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's a lot of capital ready to be deployed in Singapore and in Southeast Asia.
Very cool. Now, we talked a little bit about, or we learned also that it's a great landing and launch pad for the region. And is that most of where all of the startups are coming from? Are they coming from out of country, or is there a lot of homegrown talent and entrepreneurship that is emerging as well?
Yeah, in Singapore, there's a lot of great companies and homegrown entrepreneurial talent that is starting in Singapore and then kind of expanding, to the region. The biggest kind of startup that, if you ask somebody that's familiar with Southeast Asia, ask them to name a startup, successful startup, the one that comes to mind is Grab. So for those not familiar with Grab, it's basically started back in 2012, originally in Malaysia, and then they moved the headquarters to Singapore in 2014, I think. But they basically were a taxi booking app in the region. And what they've actually done in that since then is really grown, way past unicorn status, have grown into, basically a platform and an app where you can do literally anything. So it's not just book taxis, but it's booking, private hire vehicles, food, digital banking is something that the licenses were given out a couple of months ago in Singapore. And I believe that that's an area that's going to be really, really hot. And basically what happened was they bought Uber's operations in Southeast Asia. So they actually were able to grow, pretty fast in the region. We've had Ninja Van in Singapore, has raised substantial amounts of money. The last mile logistics is a really, really popular sector to be in Southeast Asia. So they've gone and expanded elsewhere in the region. But the interesting thing is you see a lot of those companies start in Singapore and then expand to elsewhere in the region. And Southeast Asia, or ASEAN as it's known, we call it ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, but 3 of the 15 largest countries in the world are in Southeast Asia population-wise, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. So those markets, if you look at the breakdown of deals that are happening in Southeast Asia right now, those markets, Indonesia and Singapore, those companies that are based there really see the lion's share of the deals, but you're seeing a lot more investment into companies and startups in Vietnam and companies that are started in Singapore and Indonesia expand elsewhere in the region.
Now we brought up the deals and funds again. So this capital, is it primarily coming from China? Is it Chinese? Is it Mideast? Is it U.S., Europe?
I think it's a good question. There's it kind of comes from a lot of sources. One of the interesting things that I think I've seen over the last 10 years in Singapore is, you have a lot of wealthy, families, think kind of Forbes billionaires list sort of families. They have family offices, and traditionally they had been investing in traditional asset classes and whatnot. But what you're actually starting to see now is a lot more money going into the VC funds or them directly as angel investors. So the money's really coming from, a lot of different sources. People that want to get in on the startup scene in Southeast Asia, want to, be a part of the growth that we're seeing out there. So it's really coming from a lot of different sources.
And and so these Forbes billionaires and these family offices, are they doing the investing directly themselves, or are they part of larger like syndicates?
Yeah, it's kind of, interesting. The family offices, it really just kind of depends. I always like saying that, you never really saw this until 5 or 6 years ago. And it really kind of took somebody to be successful in some startup investment that then, tells everyone else, and then everyone else follows. And I don't have a specific example, but, from what I hear, you have these family offices that might make investments directly as angel investors, or they might actually just put the money directly into the VC firms and funds that they're raising. And we've seen a lot of, very successful VC firms in Southeast Asia that have, come up in the last couple of years that have been making investments in and around the region that have done very, very well.
Now, since the deal flow is still very significant, haven't really taken much of a hit there, and the region itself has performed fairly well compared to others around the globe with COVID. How have you seen the valuations post and pre-COVID?
Personally, in my opinion, I don't think there's really been a lot of change necessarily in terms of the valuations. Particularly when you look at the research that's kind of been done, the deals that are being closed are pretty substantial. We're talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and there's some reports that just came out kind of, I think, about 2 weeks ago, where they were reporting on what's been happening in Q2. So the valuations, I don't think are really being affected kind of pre and post COVID. We're still seeing, inflows of investment to startups in Southeast Asia. The rounds are getting larger, their closes, the check sizes are doing pretty well. So I don't really think the valuations have been affected that much. If anything, my kind of, opinion is that they probably have gone up a little bit, particularly e-commerce and those spaces where there's a lot more demand right now for that, just given the pandemic.
Okay. Now, if I've got a startup and I'm starting to raise, I've got some traction. I'm in your region and it's got incredible density, right? No problem with talent, no problem finding money. As I'm going around pitching and I'm trying to build out my financial journey, what's the appetite on VCs or angels or investors on what kind of exits are the most popular?
Yeah, the exits that we've really, I'm trying to think in terms of exits in Southeast Asia, there's not a whole lot that kind of come to mind or spring to mind necessarily. I mean, there's still very much, a lot of these startups are still very much in those growth stages. So if anything, the acquisitions the startups are actually buying other companies in and around the region, or they're buying the operations of companies in and around the region. So you had Uber, which, when they were in Asia, I mean, they got, driven out of China. Didi bought their operations there, I believe. And then, in Southeast Asia, Grab wound up acquiring Uber's operations in Southeast Asia. So, if anything, you're seeing a lot of these players in Southeast Asia actually get to a point where they're the ones that are able to do the acquisitions. And then there's been some exits and everything in and around the region. So, we're seeing, there's still quite a bit of activity happening. But, the maturity of kind of the startup space, if you look at the span of it over the last 10 years, it's really within kind of that last decade, we've seen just a whole lot of startups, homegrown Singapore startups or Southeast Asia based startups that are kind of spreading their wings, going more global. So they're not quite at that exit point just yet.
And so getting deeper into the entrepreneur themselves and their opportunities. So it's a busy, dense spot, a lot of action, a lot of exciting successes being reported on all the time. So as a small entrepreneur, is it fairly easy to find like a technical co-founder or somebody in the sales and marketing roles? Is it easy to put together a team, or are people just sitting pretty in their well-funded startups and they don't want to?
The talent gap that exists in a lot of different places, where if you look at Silicon Valley and just the talent gap that tends to exist out there within kind of technical roles, where it's very competitive. In Singapore and in Southeast Asia in general, I would say there's a lot more interest to be involved in startups. So for instance, Vietnam, for instance, there's a lot of really good technical talent, people that want to work in startups and tech companies. And so tech outsourcing is actually pretty big in Vietnam. There's a lot more people that want to be involved, younger individuals that are out of university or college that want to be involved in the startup scene. So we've really seen, just more broadly across Southeast Asia, a lot more risk taking, I think, by individuals. It used to maybe be that you saw people come out of university or they studied abroad and they came back to their home countries in Southeast Asia that were, wanting the kind of the comfortable job, the secure job in a bank or a large MNC or one of the MNCs in their countries. And instead now are really focused on, wanting to either branch out and become entrepreneurs themselves or work in startups. So there's a lot of talent that exists out there from Vietnam, also in the Philippines, which is a large outsourcing market for a lot of companies. There's great talent that exists all over Southeast Asia. So, finding a technical co-founder is really not that hard, I think.
And if I'm talent and I'm say in Eastern Europe or I'm in South America, am I finding opportunities there to work with firms, startups, companies in Asia, or is it pretty insulated as far as like that 10 country region?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There's a lot of great development talent in, like Argentina, for instance, Buenos Aires, and in Eastern Europe. And a lot of companies are looking at, just where they can get really good talent. The great thing is if you have Vietnam and the Philippines in Southeast Asia, they're within your same time zone. And really, in the outsourcing industry, time zone agnosticism is pretty much the thing. It doesn't really make a major impact, but, psychologically, people still want to be close in those instances to their teams. So they want to go to Vietnam or Philippines, get on a plane and go. I mean, we can't do that now exactly, but in normal times, they want to be able to just go up there if there is an issue or a problem. So, still there's people and startups that will look very close to home for those talent and those resources, but, they're not closed off necessarily to, getting talent that's developers in Eastern Europe or Argentina, for instance.
Okay. Now, being a nice mature ecosystem, what are the barriers for an entrepreneur or founder?
The barriers, the great thing that I've really seen happen over the last 5 to 10 years is there's a lot of incentivization and schemes that are put into place to really incentivize those founders and those startups to start businesses and do that fairly easily. Singapore for decades has been known as one of the best places in the world to do business. It's one of the easiest places in the world to do business. There's startups that have come up that like Sleek that can help you get a company set up and registered and get all that paperwork done very, very quickly. So there's really not a lot of administrative barriers, I would say. It really tends to be, just how fast you can run. If you can run fast, and a lot of people want to come to Southeast Asia to start a business because, it's really, if you're a hard worker, you put the pedal to the metal, there's really not a whole lot stopping you from really scaling and growing very, very quickly just by nature of how fast all the markets in the region are growing.
So you just got to keep up.
keep up. Yeah, I mean, if you're a grinder, like we talk about the startup grind. If you're a grinder and you're just willing to grind it out every day, and you see something that can work in the market, there's really not a whole lot of barriers to stop you necessarily from going forward and achieving what you want to achieve. It's really just going to be external market factors and things, but the ecosystem is there, the support system is there, particularly in Singapore. The government has done an incredible job of building and cultivating the startup ecosystem in Singapore in ways that are great case studies for a lot of other ecosystems around the world, I think. And it's really, everything is pretty much there. The capital is definitely there now. It might not have been 10 years ago, but there's a lot of capital ready to be deployed and invested in. And even with COVID, we've seen, the amount of funding has gone up almost to $2.7 billion, I think 91% in the year so far. There's still tons of opportunities everywhere.
Sure. I think George might have a couple questions, especially with regards to the region.
Yeah.
Thank you, Corey. Curtis, this is quite an interesting picture that you're painting. On the one hand, the rapid growth of intermediation between entrepreneurs and markets, i.e. initially stylized angel investors, then the first VCs, now private equity, initially family-owned businesses of Chinese descent, reallocating capital to digitalization, e-commerce, and so on and so forth, but also a lot of Indian and Middle Eastern entrepreneurs and capital coming to Singapore because Singapore, due to its legislation and protection of shareholder rights, is the ideal place to launch in companies with solid corporate governance. Isn't corporate governance a key asset for Singapore, for investing in Singapore?
Yeah, I've been in Asia for off and on over the last 20 years. And, the traditional debate that an MNC has when they're looking at expanding to Asia or setting up their Asia operations and headquarters was, do we go to Hong Kong or do we go to Singapore? It really came down to those two cities. And, I think with what you're seeing, like in Hong Kong, for instance, with all the changes that are going on there, the business landscape is changing for sure. And I think, what I'm hearing when I talk to VCs and other founders and startups is, it makes Singapore that much more attractive. Singapore has always had a great corporate framework, intellectual property, for instance, the Intellectual Property Office of Singapore, IPOS has very, very good intellectual property protections. So, that really makes Singapore a very attractive place, all things considered, compared to some other parts of the region, because you really do need that framework there. You really do need those governance, that governance and those laws in place to ensure that, you have a great startup ecosystem. Not to say that Hong Kong doesn't. Hong Kong has a really robust and dynamic startup ecosystem where you have startups that are focused on China or those that are more focused on expanding to Western markets. But, there's definitely a bit of a sea change going on in the broader region in terms of, just where business is friendly to be conducted, or friendlier, I should say.
Yep, and we've seen that time and again across Eastern Europe. We've seen it in emerging markets that corporate governance is the number one issue. You mentioned Hong Kong, and I won't go through that again, but the observation is quite interesting. Would you expect Taiwan to benefit?
Yeah, Taiwan, first of all, I mean,
because in our simplistic mind, I'm sorry to interrupt you here, Taiwan is a sleeping giant. They have an ecosystem very similar to that of Singapore. They have developed tremendous know-how in hardware, software, and applications. And they've been able to essentially withstand all kinds of blockades from mainland China successfully.
Yeah, I mean, Taiwan's an interesting market, and Corey, reach out to the guys that run the Startup Grind chapter in Taipei. They've done quite a bit up there. I've gone to Taiwan a bunch of times. As a tourist destination, I mean, it's a really great place to visit, but it's also got a fairly up and coming startup ecosystem that is doing fairly well, I would say. And the startup grind directors there in Taipei are pretty active. So I think does that what's going on in Hong Kong, does that kind of shift the focus to Taiwan? Potentially it does. The startups up there, I'm not too familiar with them, but as a market, it's always been a very open, liberalized market for a lot of companies. You talked about tech, manufacturing chip semiconductors have been manufactured there for years. It's still a very vibrant and attractive market. But within, I think, if you're talking about Hong Kong and where the focus might shift, you might see more potentially companies and startups maybe coming to Singapore instead of Hong Kong, or looking at other countries in the region like the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam, which are kind of the three largest markets in ASEAN population wise. And we're seeing startups that are getting funded there and that are coming there that are doing amazing things.
Thank you for this regional overview. The last point that I would like to raise with you is this. A couple of years ago, as the blockchain was taking off, we had secure tokens, we had all kinds of blockchain applications emerging as major, so to speak, instruments of facilitating confidential transformation and transfer of information between participants in a closed ledger environment. Singapore was being presented by a number of participants, including lawyers who are structuring these transactions, as a center for trading these tokens, for trading these blockchain-based applications. Can you give us a little bit of an update on what's happening on this front?
Yeah, blockchain, we talked about it a lot in Startup Grind in 2017 and 2018. And it's still, there's still a big focus, I think, on blockchain and the potential for coins and, digital currencies and token offerings. It's kind of, in my perception, it's cooled down a little bit. It's, I think when you just kind of see how volatile Bitcoin is, for instance, that kind of gets people, a little bit hesitant maybe towards those sorts of different funding options. I still think it's probably more prevalent and popular in the West. It definitely has a lot of potential in Asia, though. So, we were seeing a lot of, I've always thought about blockchain and kind of token offerings as a lot of people are just looking at it and thinking, that's cool. And then the number of people jumping in is like, it's like everyone's standing around the pool going, that looks really comfortable and nice to jump into. And then nobody jumps in, and it's just like maybe one person and not a whole lot follow. So, it's still very nascent, I would say, but, what we've seen in particular is digital banking. That's kind of really, I think, if we're talking about any sort of digitalization of finance and fintech potentially, it's really kind of digital banking licenses that have, really gotten a lot of the news, particularly in Singapore. The Monetary Authority of Singapore gave out, there was a lot of applications by one of the local telco companies, it's, as well as a couple of startups to get those digital banking licenses. So we've seen that. You saw coins.ph in the Philippines. I believe Grab was the one that acquired them. I hope I'm remembering that one correctly, but they were very much focused kind of on the unbanked population in the Philippines. So there's still a large potential, I would say, for blockchain, for fintech, for coin offerings like we see here in the United States, for Southeast Asia. So I think check back with me in a year and see how it's changed.
Thank you very much for this update.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great information there. I'm curious a little bit about, are you familiar with some of the government programs that help support whether it's bringing new firms into the country, helping them export outside of the country, or just also for the small everyday entrepreneur, maybe some programs that you recommend your membership seek out?
Yeah. So the great thing is, you talk about bringing companies into Singapore and helping companies expand and go overseas. And the Singapore government actually has two government agencies that were dedicated to that. So you have the Economic Development Board of Singapore, which is very focused on bringing MNCs and companies into Singapore. Increasingly more focused on startups now and bringing those companies in. You have SG Innovate, which is one of our ecosystem partners in Singapore. They're focused on the deep tech community and building deep tech startups. And they've done a lot to bring, those sorts of companies into Singapore and set it up as home base. And then you had a government agency called International Enterprise Singapore, which helped Singapore companies go global and was very active in that. They recently merged. They basically consolidated some of the government agencies a couple of years ago just to Enterprise Singapore, which is really just to help companies and enterprises in Singapore build up and scale. So there's really great programs to help companies and startups there leverage that expertise and go abroad, and then also to come into Singapore as well if they're have significant investments that they can make and contributions.
On the startup side, are the government programs working through incubators and accelerators, or is that whole part of the ecosystem basically like operating pretty well on its own? And when people are entering those types of things, is it pretty competitive to get into those programs? Does it come with some capital usually? Are you giving up a big chunk of your company?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. You don't really see kind of government-run accelerators in and around Southeast Asia so much. That's still very much kind of the private focus. What you see a lot of is banks and larger kind of companies running their own incubators and accelerators inside the company. So you had a couple of in the banking and finance industry and around Asia, you've had a couple of those companies that want to get in on early stage companies as potential investments early on. They'll create that kind of incubation and ecosystem within their company and support that, whether that's leveraging resources that those institutions and those companies have. So it's really still the private sector, I would say. The government is still, just generally speaking within Southeast Asia, the government is still, from what I see, very focused on, bringing those companies in and helping build up the ecosystem, not making specific investment decisions or anything like that. It's really, just trying to create a conducive environment. And Singapore has done really, really well in that sense.
That's awesome. We're coming up on our time here, so I have a couple last questions here. I'm curious with so much going on in the region, your role as the chapter director for Startup Grind, what you and Archit do for your chapter. What's the place that where you guys sit? Where's your sort of sweet spot here in West Michigan? I see the clear need because we have a lot of really great resources, but they're all really siloed. So Startup Grind for our region is a really good operator in being the connective tissue between all of those resources. What is it? What kind of program? How do you get your hands dirty?
It's a good question. Singapore just being kind of the startup hub for Southeast Asia, we really kind of sit there and just try to bring people together. If you look at our attendance, we get a couple of VCs, get a lot of entrepreneurs and founders. We work very closely with a lot of the co-working spaces there to bring programming and content. So, I've always been somebody that's been a bit of a connector and connecting people over the years. And it's really just we just want to be that space and that place where people come together, share ideas, network, and connect. Archit and, I guess, Corey, if you want him to jump in, he can give you a little bit more color on this since he's an active angel investor. But, we really just try to bring a lot of the community together. We try to be that glue. It is honestly, there's a lot of events, a lot of startup space, a lot of, startup events going on in Singapore, just being in the hub, there's a lot of a lot of other entities out there that are doing programming and events, and we never really think of them as competitors.
Mm-hmm.
Or how can we work together to help further the startup ecosystem and the startup space in Southeast Asia?
Oh, very good. George, would you have any questions for Archit since he's operating in that VC capacity?
Yes. First of all, Archit, how do you invest?
So I
What is your
invest as,
criteria? What are your criteria? What are you?
good question. So I invest in a very angel seed stage sort of investment level. I invest in startups which are at the seed, not necessarily pre-seed, but mostly between the sweet spot is between seed to Series A, as far as individual startups go. Because we operate as a family office here in Singapore, we're still quite immature as far as investing is concerned. So we act as LPs for certain venture capital firms, and also, we're quite well connected with the VC space here. I mean, there's some very interesting VCs in Singapore that are focused on the Southeast Asia region, as well as as well as try to access the capital that's available in Southeast Asia and basically invest around the world. And that's basically what I do. The sweet spot as far as size of investment goes. As far as individual check sizes from my side, it's ranged from 10,000 all the way up to 500,000, 750,000, and then above that, basically try to get along with other family offices, come together, and then basically syndicate much bigger rounds if we think that the startup is interesting. Now, because I come from a very pharmaceutical and healthcare background, those are startups which I would prefer to invest in myself, and then try to help them out if, as far as future fundraisers go, or as far as connecting them with the right venture capital companies is concerned. That would be something that I would do. Co-investing with others, 100%. That is something that we always do. We talk to other people we know in the industry, or we know other family offices that are in the industry that they're probably experts in that industry, which we're not, and we're probably going to take their advice and then see if we should come together and then form a syndicate. In a very old school way, since Asia is also known for a lot of old school investors, especially the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, the Indians, and also the Chinese at some point. So they're not really familiar with angel lists and all of that. So it's my job as a millennial to try to make them familiar on how we can syndicate these investments.
And how interactive are you with these investee companies? Do you take a active role in their day-to-day, keeping tabs, mentoring?
Yeah, no, there are a few companies which I have taken an active role in, especially the ones where I think I might be of value. It's all about adding value to the company. If there are companies where I've invested in I'm not going to take any names, in an AR VR tech company where I have zero background. It's purely out of interest for the aviation space and for the VR and AR space, and they're doing pretty well. Which is where I'll just be a sleeping investor and help them in the round. But there are companies where, since we belong, for family business in India, which is a generic pharmaceutical manufacturing. So if there are healthcare companies which would want to vertically integrate eventually, or would look for outsourcing in the healthcare space, let's say in Asia or in India or in China or in Germany, that is somewhere where there is definitely a value add. And I would look at investing in the initial round, and also try to get in and see if we can be on the board and help them out in the future as far as future fundraising is concerned, and also as far as giving them the right direction is concerned.
Being such an active investor, and with such a wide range of investment sizes, I imagine that with the Startup Grind community that you both serve, you probably are pretty active as far as people come in, and you have a lot of inbound requests for advice probably. And then being involved in investments across different sectors, industries, those which you have domain expertise in, and those that you don't. And this is a question for both of you, what are some of the more popular pieces of advice you're giving out now, or maybe some of the questions or challenges that your membership are experiencing at this time?
I think, the questions that we're getting is, I talked to somebody that wanted to, from Eastern Europe that wanted to come in and expand to Singapore. That kind of does work with FMCG kind of consumer packaged goods. And, the advice I gave was, I'll connect them to a couple of people in that space, but, the advice I gave is keep going, particularly with COVID and the pandemic. You talk kind of the whole headline of this is silver linings. And, every time that there's a crisis of economic kind of uncertainty that we have right now, there are opportunities there. Just go look, just Google search the number of companies that are very prevalent in our lives today that came out of the 2008, 2009 global financial crisis that were founded then. So, the advice to entrepreneurs and startups that I give that are looking at the region is, just come and talk to people. And if you can't travel, do it virtually. Come attend the Startup Grind events or reach out to us if you're interested and really want to do something in Southeast Asia, because a lot of it is connections based. I had a former boss tell me, kind of the three most important things when you come out to Asia is family, face, and friends. Those three, family, face, and friends, those three F's are pretty much the most important things that you need when you're doing business in Asia, I would say, because, and Archie can probably attest to this, a lot of people that are putting money into funds, it's somebody they know or somebody recommended them. And that happens everywhere, but it really takes on a significant level of importance in Southeast Asia and Asia in general. So those are pretty much the things. Be very well networked, go meet people, make connections. And that's how a lot of business happens in Asia these days. Archie, you can probably add to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'd definitely second that. I think Asia is definitely relationship based. Obviously you have other parts of the world. Eastern Europe is a good example where, we do a lot of business and it's also very relationship based. But I think Asia specifically, it could be anywhere. It could be Southeast Asia. It could be Japan, Korea, mainland, as well as India and the Middle East. There's a lot of very close families, which basically there has to be some level of interaction with someone they know or someone they trust, and it does take a while to basically break into the bubble. But once you do, a place like Singapore is Singapore is a very good spot because you're on an island where you have a lot of investors who are from these large countries that are 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours flying distance from Singapore, and they have based themselves here for economic reasons, for tax reasons, for the ease of doing business that Singapore has to offer versus the bureaucracy and red tapes that you can encounter in Vietnam or in Philippines or in India or in some parts of Indonesia as well. Indonesia, Malaysia, where you'll see a lot of the emerging market families basically headquarter themselves in Singapore. They have their headquarters in Singapore or their holding company in Singapore. I do the same. We have our holding company in Singapore because India is so hard. It's a difficult country to operate in as far as bureaucracy is concerned. And this is where the connections and the relationships come in.
That's a lot of really good insight. I think George has a couple more questions, and then I'm probably going to skip off. I've got to head into another meeting here. But before George asks his couple questions here, I just want to say thank you so much, for joining us. Really appreciate the generosity of your time. So George, I'll let you wrap it up.
Thank you, Corey. Guys, this has been a very, very interesting conversation because not only of the timing of what you're doing in Singapore. I just noticed on the news that the European Central Bank announced that is extending the remote working to the end of the year as virus is picking up throughout Europe. You know that HSBC reported quarterly results earlier this morning in Hong Kong time. Profits down 65% year on year. Losses for the quarter for non-performing assets, $13 billion. This is a massive, massive hit to the point where the chief executive has announced that he's restructuring the entire operation. Noel Quinn, the CEO, said that this is still a hugely unpredictable environment. If you allow me for a moment, I want to show you something which is fascinating. Have a look at real time what is happening to the share price of HSBC. From a recent high on the 22nd of May of 2019 at about $50 a share, down to 21.35, the low for the day. The stock is trading 21.7. What do you see happening in the next normal? How would you describe, given your expertise, the next normal?
The next normal, I think, from a financing perspective,
from startup, from angel investor, from entrepreneurship, from any perspective you want to choose.
Yeah.
But also operationally.
Yeah, I think, kind of the new normal that we're going to be in for a while, if I had a crystal ball to look into, it's things aren't really going to get, back to normal per se until there's a vaccine or effective treatment or a combination of the two that, effectively means that if you were to contract the virus and get COVID, that, you have very, very, very good and high chances of survival. So I think operationally, number one, what startups need to do is start thinking about the ways that you want to work. There's a lot of great stories out there of startups that are completely distributed and fully remote, teams of 20 or 30 people in the total company that are not physically all in the same place. Do I think that that's the way every company is going to be going forward? Absolutely not. There's still things that, you need to do in person. There's still things from a psychological perspective, things that happen, neurons that fire in your brain when you actually come together as a team in person and brainstorm in person. So I think the Wall Street Journal just had an article on this, and I think Wired Magazine also touched on this recently about, how there's kind of remote work fatigue, and it's really working from home. We're not, somebody put it really good the other day. It's, it's not so much we're working from where we live, we're now living where we work. So I think, companies need to learn to adapt. Remote work is going to be here for a while. The tech companies in Silicon Valley have all said that, people can work from home through, I forget who it was exactly that said for a whole nother year they can work from home. Some have said that they will allow people to work from home indefinitely. I don't think that that's going to become, as time goes on, too popular, because people are going to crave some sort of social interaction, and that interaction that does happen in the office. And then, just from like a financing perspective, I mean, it's interesting what you've seen with the banks and everything in terms of, the stock price there and the earnings that are coming out. So, traditional forms of financing, whether if you're in manufacturing and you're looking to finance purchase orders or take out small business loans, in outside of the United States, that could be particularly harder going forward. So it's really, I think, people need to just network and keep their options open in order to adapt to the new normal going forward.
Thank you, Curtis. Archit, what do you see? What is the mindset of investors in Singapore?
So as of now, I mean, I do see them investing and raising and investing and raising. I was kind of wrong. I thought that they're gonna, stay put and not do much. But since this is a finance hub, we did see them investing in. We have friends who invested in March and in April and in May, which was basically April and May was basically the lockdown period in Singapore. They gave it a nicer name. They called it circuit breaker. I mean, Curtis, you know this as well. And that was a period when Singapore, which was a booming economy, basically was kind of crippled. Basically towards the end of May, because you saw a country which is dependent on service industry, heavily dependent on service industry, collapse into something which now you're having 40% retrenchments in most of their service sector. you're looking at, this is an aviation hub, which depends on their airline, which depends on their airport for a lot of things. And you do see the losses that basically every airline in the world is going to face, but including Singapore Airlines. I think they're declaring about 1.1 billion Singapore dollars as a quarterly loss, which is about 850 to 900 million US, which is still, I mean, as of now, you look at different companies in the aviation sector in the world, and if you focus on that, since that is a big chunk of Singapore's GDP, I would say Singapore Airlines, it's all about, okay, how do you compare with your competitors, and as of now, I mean, they have been hit, but they haven't been as badly hit as their competitors. I mean, you look at the aviation industry in the US, or do you look at the other competitors that Singapore Airlines has, like Qantas or Cathay Pacific, they're probably going to be worse off. So towards the end, as far as the aviation outlook goes in Singapore, it's gonna benefit them in the long term, because you're gonna have all these smaller players that have emerged go into losses, and some of them are going to be unsustainable, and some of them are going to have to shut down, which is probably going to put them back on the map as the aviation hub. It might take a while. It might take a couple of years, 3 years, 4 years even, to come back to 2019 level. But that's as far as that outlook is concerned. As far as investing from a VC point of view and from a startup point of view is concerned, I mean, I don't know if you guys read, B Capital Group raised one of their largest funds of about $850 million. This was one of the largest fundraise that B Capital Group did. And although, B Capital does have a large presence in the US, they are headquartered here. Eduardo Saverin and his partner Ganguly, they both live here in Singapore, and they had a major role to play. Other smaller venture capital companies like Golden Gate and Monk Sale, which are also having some presence in Singapore, they also are successfully raising funds and investing in initiatives like Singapore's food initiative, like 30 under 30, 30 by 30. So, which is basically what Singapore is doing. Singapore, as everyone knows, is largely dependent on imports for food and for, pretty much everything. So as of now, Singapore is planning to basically reduce their dependency to, so they're trying to be independent by 2030, which is saying 30% dependency on local products instead of, importing much. Only time will tell if they succeed. One of our last events in Startup Grind Singapore was actually based on food and homegrown food in Singapore, and we interviewed a bunch of companies which are based in the US, the Middle East, as well as one from Singapore. Curtis, feel free to expand and chime in wherever you can.
That's a good point. And I think the other thing, George, to talk about is kind of the new normal, and this is broadly applicable, I think, to a lot of economies around the world and companies around the world, is you're going to start to see a lot of consolidation now. I mentioned a lot of acquisitions, like when we were talking earlier about exits, you don't really see a whole lot of exits going on. You see a lot of startups within Southeast Asia acquiring assets or expanding. I talked about coins.ph. I misspoke. Gojek was the one that bought coins.ph, not Grab. I just want to correct that for the record there, but you're going to start to see a lot more, I think, mergers and acquisitions happen within the startup community. Definitely things where there's a lot of competitors. You're going to start to see a lot of larger startups potentially expand into other markets via acquisition versus organically growing in those markets. So I think that's kind of going to be one of the predictions is, you're going to start to see a lot more of this VC funding. And, Arch had touched on it in terms of the size of funds that we're seeing in Southeast Asia. They're going to do a lot more investing in Southeast Asia startups. And then you're going to get these unicorn companies in Southeast Asia that are going to wind up acquiring some of these other fast-growing, smaller startups in other markets in and around Southeast Asia. So I think that's my prediction for what's going to happen.
Thank you. This debate with both of you is really illuminating. And I think what you mentioned is correct. We will see, and we are seeing already, opportunistic M&A. We're seeing diversification in areas that companies were expecting to pivot 2 or 3 years from today, but because of the nature of the market, the acceleration is phenomenal. We see that in education technology, in telehealthcare, for instance. These are major areas where we're seeing the diversification.
Yeah,
And
telehealth is a really big one. There's a company in Singapore called Doctor Anywhere. And, I'm just trying to remember this off the top of my head, so I hope I'm getting it right. But, just Google Doctor Anywhere and, look at what they've been able to do over the last year and the partnerships that they've been able to set up. COVID has been a catalyst and a driver for a lot of industries and a lot of companies. And, you see that with earnings in the United States for major e-commerce companies that we're all relying on now, and in Southeast Asia, I don't think it's too much of a different story. A lot of countries like Singapore is fairly open. They're kind of in a new normal right now, and Archie can attest to that. So a lot of things are still open, but in the United States, a lot of us are still relying on e-commerce to get our groceries and everything. And other markets in and around Southeast Asia might not be as open as some of the other economies since they're all dealing with COVID. So, it's a really interesting time. There's going to be opportunities in a lot of different sectors as the landscape shifts and adjusts. COVID is a terrible thing. It's a horrible thing that's happening, and it's affected pretty much everyone in this world in some way, shape, and form. And we all want it to be gone, but when the tectonic plates of Earth move around, you're seeing these seismic shifts happen in the startup ecosystems around the world. There's going to be shifts and adjusting and, pivots that companies have to do, regardless of what the crisis is or the obstacles that they're facing.
thank you. The last point that I would like to bring to this conversation, and something that we've noticed time and again, is deficits in corporate governance. And what I mean by that is that we have noticed both here in the US, but also overseas, that young entrepreneurs don't understand the meaning of a company. What is a company? From the legal perspective, from the organizational perspective, from the board of directors, from the responsibilities to shareholders, from auditing financials, and so on and so forth, but also from the point of view of decision making. How much time do you spend training and coaching the investee companies that you select?
That's an interesting question. I think the good thing is in Singapore, the people I've talked to, and Archie can add to this, but since he's a lot more active on investing in companies and startups, it just kind of comes naturally to people about, like, if you're going to start a business or a company, like what exactly you need to do, what's the paperwork that you have to get done. And I think part of that is just because Singapore has been such an amazingly easy place to set up a business or a company. And now you've seen some startups come onto the scene to actually help people do that quicker and faster, like Sleek that I mentioned earlier. It's just kind of like second nature to people, that they realize, oh, these are the things that you have to do, and get the governance, to get the legal framework and the structure of a company set up in a place like Singapore. I think, really where a lot of entrepreneurs all around the world struggle with is cap tables and, just how to, set up a board and put the framework in place so that you can grow and scale. So that it's not, an absolute mess down the road where you have to spend a lot of time cleaning it up. So, that really, I think, is probably the biggest piece of advice that I give out to startups and founders is, it's not so much necessarily setting up the company, setting up a private limited company, which is, what typically happens in Singapore. It's not so much, the paperwork there. It's really, think about where you want to go and build the stuff out now, so that, when you are out there raising money and you are talking to people, you have all your ducks lined up in a row, so that, you're organized, and make sure your cap tables and all of that is done. And Startup Grind is, as a community, has those resources. I think the guys in San Francisco just, I think it was last week or the week before, they had a session on, cap tables and fundraising, how to structure that sort of stuff. And it's fairly eye-opening, because that's typically one of the things that I hear, and Archie can probably add to this, that that's usually the thing where a lot of startups are deficient in the early days, is figuring out how to allocate founder shares and all those things. Archie, you can probably add to that.
100%. I think a lot of startups are having the same situation where, okay, the founder shares, valuation, what is the correct valuation? And that is a question probably almost every event I've been to, and Curtis, you as well. Every event I've been to where there's VCs on the panel or there's private equity guys on the panel, mostly VCs, almost someone in the audience is going to ask a question who is most likely going to be a startup founder or someone who is wanting to be a startup founder about the valuation. And that question is the most interesting one of all. I think valuation I would say some of the startups are undervalued in certain regions and some of them are overvalued. You do see generally in a more mature market like the United States, I wouldn't say United States as a country, but let's say California or Massachusetts or New York or certain areas where the startup ecosystem is well developed. In Austin, Texas as well, which is doing well. Startups generally have a approach which is, look at Silicon Valley or Austin or Boston, you're going to see valuations at a much higher level than what you would see at a similar company or a company that is trying to do something which is very similar innovation in terms of IP, in terms of a lot of other things in Singapore or in the Philippines or in Vietnam. Although there's not many companies that would have that kind of R&D or IP behind it, there still are some. And the local ecosystem is just not matured enough for the people to decide on how to value these companies, because you have very old school auditors. VCs have an approach where, okay, some of the VCs that are here in Singapore are very international. They've all studied at MIT, they've all studied at Berkeley and Stanford and Harvard, and they have an approach to investing, but at the same time, there's very few of them. And that's why there is still a gap in the market where you will see that there are companies that need advice, and there is definitely room to advise them. And that is where the government of Singapore, the government of most governments in Southeast Asia, mostly Singapore, because Singapore is aspiring to be the startup capital here in Asia. You'll see them trying to create these initiatives. They're trying to create the most interesting initiative during COVID was the seed stage matching capital initiative, which was basically I don't think any other country has ever done this before. So if you're a healthcare startup, yeah, sure, go for it. Curtis is excited. You should go for it.
Yeah, the Singapore government did, and you can just Google search this, and I'm glad Archit brought it up, because we were talking about things that governments are doing to kind of support the startup ecosystem, but they came out and had a certain matching component, and I forget what the number is, and I don't want to give incorrect information, but there was a certain matching component that they were going to give to really kind of encourage people to invest in companies and startups. So it was very, very interesting, and I'll try to find it and send the link out. But yeah, I'm glad Archit mentioned that, because it was really a pretty unique thing and a pretty aggressive thing that was launched back then when it came out. It really kind of caught a lot of people by surprise, I think, in a good way.
Well, very, very nice conversation. Gentlemen from Boston, from Singapore, Archit, Curtis, thank you so much for being present. As Corey and I always said when we close our interviews, we're happy to provide any assistance you need. With Calvin University, which is based in Grand Rapids, we are setting up a global campus, so we can always give hands-on advice and expertise. If there's anything we can do from the Great Lakes area, please let us know. Have a great day, and thank you once again.
I've been to Calvin's campus. I checked it. I visited the campus after high school. I looked at it as one of the universities to go to. So I'm very familiar with Calvin's campus.
Well, you should, when you have time, when we start traveling again, please, you're both invited to our homes here in West Michigan.
Sounds great. Really appreciate
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Great success and great health going forward. Bye for now.
Thank you.